Hello, BookTube. I need to have a conversation about general fiction. If you've been watching my channel for any length of time, you will know periodically I read general fiction or literary fiction or realistic fiction or however you want to term this particular genre of fiction. And I will almost invariably bail on it. It's maybe once or twice a year there's a novel I read that I don't hate, that I don't bail on, that I complete. Sometimes I will really like it, and sometimes it's just an unsatisfying okay. Excuse me. And that's, but I keep coming back to it, even though, I should know by now that for whatever reason, general fiction doesn't really do it for me, that I keep coming back to it periodically. And that's what I want to get at in this video. It's not necessarily why general fiction doesn't quite do it for me. I suspect a lot of that has to do with the fact that while the prose is pretty for the most part, and maybe interesting things are done with character and maybe really fleshed out characters compared to genre fiction, but the plots really aren't there. But getting back to why, I originally thought this was nostalgia. So when I moved on from children's lit, what would now be called middle grade, I skipped over what would now be called young adult. I'm not entirely sure when middle grade and young adult became sort of age-geared genres. I'm thinking it was like into the late 90s or early 2000s rather than in the mid 90s when I kind of graduated from children's lit and moved in straight into adult fiction. And for about 5 years or so, from about 12 to 17, give or take, I was really into detective fiction. Agatha Christie, most of all. But there were others, Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. I think I read The Purloined Letter around this time too. Some May Gray novels, two P.D. James novels, some Colin Dexter novels, an Earl Stanley Gardner novel, and others that I don't quite remember now. But then when I was about 17, could have been 16, I discovered adult science fiction and fantasy. The Eleni Mentemuli trilogies by David Eddings, the Tor Conan pastiches, and I just fell in love with science fiction and fantasy, and I've been in love with science fiction and fantasy ever since. But for years I thought there was a bit of an intermediate period between my high school science fiction craze and my post-college science fiction craze. And this was like when I read mostly literary fiction or general fiction or realistic fiction, again, however you want to term it. But I don't think that's necessarily true, thinking back on this, that while these periods of reading aren't exclusive, I do read other things and have enjoyed other things, but this is mostly what I've been focusing on. This is mostly what I've loved. But that even while I was in college, my main focus was still science fiction and fantasy. I'm remembering going to Book People, the storied independent bookstore in Austin, and spending far more time in the science fiction and fantasy section than I did in the more general fiction section. So I think pretty much for the last 20 years, my main reading focus has been science fiction and fantasy. So I think in a way nostalgia over my college years isn't really why I keep coming back to science fiction and fantasy. So what other explanations do I have? I had thought for a while that maybe it was a bit of booktube related, that the conversation surrounding general fiction on booktube is so much more interesting and so much more joyful in a way than what I've seen with science fiction and fantasy. Although that could also be I'm subscribed to more booktubers who focus more on literary fiction or general fiction than I do science fiction and fantasy, and those who do focus on science fiction and fantasy tend to be a bit more YA or the more popular crowd of science fiction and fantasy. But the more I think about it, I'm not entirely sure that's true, because I've tended to have this issue crop up. The periodic hunger for general fiction, even before BookTube. So I'm thinking it has more to do with my reading and my personality than it does with BookTube. And it took me a lot of false starts to finally hit on this as the likely solution. I mean, I've been trying to make this video for about 2 or 3 weeks now, and there have been numerous false starts and dropped takes. I mean, I don't edit my videos, and so if I screw up, it's basically, I either have to soldier on or just abandon it. And that's usually like why I'm silent on Mondays, is I'm trying to do a discussion video of some kind or other, and it fails, and I basically have to abandon it. But I think taking the time to really work this out might have helped me. And so after that bit of a tangent, I think the problem is with my reading. I try to read as diversely or as widely as I can, because if I binge too much on any one genre for any length of time, I'm going to get tired of it, and I'm going to lose patience with it, and I'm going to start a bell cascade, where it's basically I bail on everything. And it's also a bit of it's a reading slump too. But also, if I am in a reading slump, whatever I'm currently targeting in my reading for that time period is going to get the blame for it, and I overreact. And so I basically go to the extreme. And what's more extreme than science fiction and fantasy? General fiction. So I think what happens is I get into a reading slump, and I've been in a reading slump for quite a bit now. I mean, there have been a few bright spots, but for the most part, this year has been rather rough reading-wise. So basically, when I get into these slumps, I'm looking for the most, completely other end of the spectrum. And I mean, that is general fiction. And whether there's some bit of the booktube envy, or the, maybe not nostalgia, but something there that just makes general fiction or literary fiction quite appealing, at least to think about, or at least to listen to, watch the conversation, if not necessarily to read, then I kind of have that turn. And it's, I think, becoming quite apparent this past reading slump because even though in late-ish February I had the bright idea to read 4 works of general fiction in a row, like a big batch to round out February. Lot by Brian Washington, The Alamo House by Sarah Bird, The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, and Swimming in the Dark by Tomas Jadrowski. And excepting for Swimming in the Dark, which I didn't even attempt after bailing on the previous 2 books, then I'm like, okay, I'm taking a break from literary fiction for a while. And now that I'm in a slump, my eye is kind of, and I've been reading quite a lot of science fiction and fantasy, and they're really not doing it for me. That my eye's kind of like, maybe I ought to pick up some more general fiction. Maybe I should read some more general fiction, even though, I mean, the most likely result is I'm going to have a Bell Cascade. So, and it's something I do, when I'm in a reading slump, is I overreact. It's also with me in art supplies, that when I'm in a reading slump, I'm more geared, like I want to pick up some more art supplies, even though I very rarely actually do. So, yeah, now, I'm not entirely sure, now that I've figured out why I periodically have this yearning to go back to general fiction. I don't know what exactly I'm going to do with this knowledge. Because, I mean, it's one thing to break a habit. And that's something I get. Well, I mean, I guess one of the things is that even though, for the most part, it doesn't really work for me, I mean, there are those moments like that, the hunt for the 1 or 2 books that will work for me. Or also just really learning to be patient and just let the book work. And if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. It's just something I have to remind myself constantly. So, yeah. So, hopefully this video helps me kind of work through either not overreacting to reading slumps or handling general fiction going on in the future. And maybe it might help some of you if you have similar problems. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and sign off, and I will see you tomorrow or later with weekly reads. And yeah, so until then, thank you, BookTube. Have a great afternoon, and stay safe.